She had traveled 900 miles to start a new life. They sent her back in under 10 minutes. The matchmaking agent didn't even look up from his ledger when he told her. Too old. Too plain. Not what the rancher ordered. Adeline Rowan stood in that train station with her one good trunk and the careful stitching of a dress she'd made herself, and she understood, clearly, the way you understand things that cut deep, that she had been returned like a piece of freight that didn't meet specifications. What no one counted on was the rancher himself showing up. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Beside him on the bench, his daughter Lucy sat with her hands folded in her lap, her Sunday dress ironed flat, her dark hair braided with a blue ribbon she had tied herself 3 times before she got it straight. She was 8 years old and she had been preparing for this day for 2 weeks, and Elias had spent those same 2 weeks trying not to think about it at all. "Do you think she'll like the ribbon?" Lucy asked. "What ribbon?" "This one." She pointed at her own hair. "I picked blue because Mama used to say blue was a friendly color." Elias looked at his daughter for a moment. She was staring forward at the road with that careful, hopeful expression she had whenever she wanted something badly enough that she was afraid to say so. "I think she'll notice it," he said. That was the best he could offer. Gideon tucked the square into his shirt pocket and pulled his gloves back on. "Fix that post," he said, and walked back to his horse. He didn't answer the boy's question. He wasn't sure yet what the answer was. The truth was, the whole arrangement sat wrong with him. It had from the beginning. 3 months ago, his neighbor Cal Whitmore had suggested it over a fence post and a tin cup of bad coffee, the way men in the territory suggested things they were too polite to outright push, with a sideways look and a lot of throat clearing. "There's an agency out of Ohio. Decent women, widows mostly, or women with no prospects back east. You write a letter, they write back, you come to an understanding." Elias had said he'd think about it. Then he'd gone home and stared at the ceiling above his bed for 2 hours and thought about his daughter learning to braid her own hair because there was no one to teach her, and thought about the long winters when the house felt like the inside of a sealed box. And by morning, he had written the letter. Her name was Nora Ash. She was 26, originally from Illinois, had been working as a seamstress after the family she'd been employed with relocated east. Her letters were brief but not cold, practical, measured, the letters of a woman who had learned not to want too much and was careful about what she put in writing. She said she could cook and keep a house, and she was not afraid of hard weather. She said she understood this was a practical arrangement, and she had no illusions about it. The agency, the Continental Placement Bureau, out of Chicago, had matched him with a woman named Adeline Rowan, 34, seamstress, from a town in Ohio he'd never heard of. Her letter had been careful and plain-spoken. She hadn't described herself as beautiful or accomplished. She'd written that she was a hard worker, that she didn't mind difficult conditions, and that she was looking for a life that was real rather than comfortable. He'd read that phrase 3 times. A life that was real rather than comfortable. He'd thought that sounded like someone who understood something true about the world. The agency's telegram said she was being returned as unsuitable for frontier placement. No further explanation. He drank the cold coffee. He thought about the phrase unsuitable for frontier placement and the way it reduced a human being to the language of a shipping manifest. He thought about a woman sitting on a train, traveling west with her hopes arranged and her life packed in a trunk, and then being told she was being sent back. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. Thursday morning, he told Colt to handle the feeding, and he hitched the wagon and drove the 11 miles to Mill Haven in the dark. The town of Mill Haven had been built on optimism and ore money, and neither had lasted. What remained was a main street of weathered storefronts, a grain exchange, 2 saloons that served as the town's primary social institutions, and a train station that the railroad company had built too large for the traffic it actually received, so that the waiting room always felt slightly mournful, like a suit made for a bigger man. Gideon arrived early and tied the horses at the post outside. The morning was iron gray and cold enough that his breath came out in solid-looking clouds. Inside the station, the ticketing agent was asleep behind his window. A woman was sitting on the far bench with a trunk at her feet. He stopped in the doorway. She was looking down at her hands when he came in, and she didn't look up right away. He had time to observe her before she knew she was being observed. Dark hair pinned back with the kind of economy that comes from doing it yourself in bad light. No mirror assistance required. A green wool coat, good fabric but old. Her hands were in her lap, and he could see even from across the room that they were a working woman's hands. Her face, when she finally raised it, was composed in a way that looked like it had cost her something to achieve. She was not what the agency's catalog photographs usually produced. She wasn't a young woman advertising herself. She was a woman who had gathered herself up after something difficult and was sitting with the result of that gathering. Their eyes met. She didn't look away first. "Miss Rowan," he said. A pause. She assessed him the way people assess something unexpected. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know who I am. I don't know who you are." Gideon Mercer. Something moved through her expression, recognition, and something harder to name. She straightened slightly on the bench. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was very even. "I assume they telegraphed you." "They did." "Then you know I'm waiting for the noon train." She looked back down at her hands. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I understand it's a long drive out here." He walked across the room and sat down on the bench opposite her, leaving the trunk between them like a piece of furniture. "What did they tell you?" he said. She looked up again. She hadn't expected that question. "That I was being returned," she said. "That I didn't meet the requirements for frontier placement." "Did they say what requirements?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "They said I was too old, that frontier ranchers require younger women who can—" She stopped and started again. "Their word was adapt. They said older women don't adapt." "That's a fairly stupid thing to say," Gideon said. She blinked. "It may be. It's what they said." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, turning his hat in his hands. "The man who delivered that message, name of Garrett, works for the Bureau. Did he look you in the face when he said it?" "No." "Didn't think so." He turned the hat again. "I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "All right." "Your letter said you were looking for a life that was real rather than comfortable. Did you mean that, or was that something you wrote because you thought it was the right thing to say?" The question surprised her into silence for a moment. Then she said, "I meant it." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I've had comfortable and it wasn't enough. I've had a small room and reliable employment and nothing to show for it at the end of the day except the same small room. I'm 34 years old and I sent that letter because I wanted something I could build, something that would outlast me." She paused. "That probably sounds presumptuous." "It sounds like a reason," he said. The ticketing agent had woken up behind his window and was pretending not to listen. Gideon ignored him. "I want to be honest with you," Gideon said. "The Bureau sent me notice to choose a replacement. I'm not here to accept their decision. I'm here because something about this whole arrangement bothered me." He was quiet for a moment, picking his words. "The ranch is 30 miles out. The nearest neighbor is 7 miles. In winter it can be 15 degrees below zero and the work doesn't stop. I won't tell you it's easy because it isn't. I won't promise you anything I don't know I can deliver. But I'll tell you this. I have no interest in someone who's here because they had no other option. If you come, I want it to be your decision, not the Bureau's, not mine, yours." Adeline studied him. She'd been looked at and assessed all week, by the Bureau agent, by the women in the rooming house where she'd stayed, by the conductor on the train who'd seen her status change from outbound to returning. She was accustomed by now to being evaluated and found insufficient. This felt different. He was not evaluating her. He was making her an offer. "What exactly are you proposing?" she said. "Come to the ranch. See it for what it is. There's a room, your own room, no obligations attached to it. You work when you're able and you learn the rest. At the end of 30 days, if you want to go, I'll drive you to the station myself and buy your ticket wherever you want to go. If you want to stay," he left that open. "And if I go back east now?" He looked at her directly. "You go back east now. The Bureau finds me a younger woman who adapts. Life proceeds." He didn't say it with cruelty. He said it like someone laying out true things. Adeline was quiet for what felt like a long time. Through the station windows she could see the gray sky beginning to lighten toward something that wasn't quite morning yet, but was on its way. The train would come from the east at noon. You drove 11 miles in the dark, she said finally, just to offer me the choice. You're not freight, he said. Nobody should be sent back without at least being asked what they want. She looked at her trunk. She looked at the windows. She looked at the man across from her, who was turning his hat in his hands with the patient manner of someone who already knew that waiting was part of the job. I have one question, she said. Ask it. Have you had a woman on your ranch before? Not a wife. A woman working alongside you? No. Then you don't know how it'll go. No, he said again. I don't. She stood up. She wasn't a tall woman, but she stood like someone taking up the space she was entitled to. Then neither do I, she said. We'll both find out. She picked up the handle of her trunk. After a moment, he stood and took the other end. The drive out was long and cold, and they didn't talk much, which suited them both. Gideon had brought a wool blanket, and she pulled it across her lap without being asked. The horses moved steadily through a landscape that was enormous and pale and completely indifferent to their presence. Flat reaches of winter grass, distant ridgelines furred with pine, the occasional huddle of cottonwoods along a creek bed that had been frozen since October. Adeline watched it all without comment. She was filing it away, he could tell, making the internal adjustments between what she'd imagined and what was in front of her. He didn't interrupt that process. She spoke eventually, about 2 hours into the drive. How many cattle? 240 head. Was 280, but we lost 40 in last February's storm. Horses? 7 working horses, 2 mares with foals coming in spring. Hands? 1 full-time colt. He's 17, good worker but young. I hire seasonal help for branding and harvest. She nodded, absorbing this. You've been running that alone? You and a 17-year-old? And myself, yes. That explains some things, she said. He glanced at her. What things? Why you needed a partner more than a wife. He was quiet. Then, that's a perceptive thing to say. It's an obvious thing from where I'm sitting. He almost smiled. He didn't quite make it. The ranch has 2 main buildings, house and a bunkhouse where Colt sleeps. The house has 4 rooms. The one in the back has a bolt on the inside of the door. That's the room? That's the room. She looked at him briefly. Thank you for saying that before we arrived. Seemed like important information. They were quiet again. The wind had picked up and was moving through the grass in long, rippling waves, like something breathing. The bureau agent, she said after a while. Garrett, what will he do when he finds out? Send a strongly worded letter, most likely. Gideon adjusted the reins. The bureau has arrangements with a few of the larger ranchers in the territory. They'll hear about it. Probably say I made a mistake. Will that cause problems for you? He thought about it honestly. Some. There are men in this valley whose opinion of me I'll have to live without. She turned to look at him fully for the first time since they'd left the station. And that doesn't concern you? I've lived without the opinion of men like that before, he said. It didn't kill me, Ma. The ranch appeared at dusk, a cluster of dark shapes against the snow, smoke rising from the main chimney in a thin, wind-blown line. Adeline had expected something rougher, something more provisional. The house was small, but it sat solid on its foundation, and whoever had built it had bothered to square the corners and hang the shutters properly. The barn was larger than the house, which was right for a ranch of this size. The fence lines she could see were in reasonable repair. Colt was coming out of the barn with a lantern when they pulled up. He stopped when he saw Adeline and looked at Gideon with an expression that asked several questions at once. Miss Rowan will be staying, Gideon said. She's taking the back room. Colt's expression cycled through surprise and then settled on an uncertain welcome. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Colt, she said. Colt gestured at the horses. I'll take 'em. Inside, the kitchen was cold because the stove had gone down. Gideon built the fire back up while Adeline stood in the middle of the room and looked at everything with careful eyes. The mismatched chairs, the shelf of preserved goods, the window over the sink that someone had patched with oilcloth where the glass had cracked and not yet been replaced. It's not finished, he said, without turning around from the stove. No, she agreed. But it's not pretending to be something it isn't. The fire caught. The stove began to tick with heat. He turned around, and she was still looking around the kitchen, taking inventory. There's salt pork in the larder, he said. And cornmeal. If you're hungry, I can... I'll do it, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She found the larder and opened it and assessed its contents with the kind of efficiency that made clear she was accustomed to working with what was available and not wasting time on what wasn't. Sit down, she said. You've been driving since before dawn. He sat down. It occurred to him that he had not been told to sit down in his own kitchen in 9 years, and that it was not as unwelcome as he might have expected. She made something out of the salt pork and cornmeal and some dried beans she found at the back of the larder, and it was better than what he would have made from the same materials. They ate at the kitchen table without much conversation. Colt came in, ate his portion standing at the counter the way he always did, and went back to the bunkhouse. Outside, the wind was serious now, pushing against the house with purpose. Storm coming? Gideon said. Adeline looked at the window. Will it be bad? Probably. She nodded and said nothing else about it. Later, he showed her the back room. It was not large, a bed, a washstand, a trunk at the foot of the bed, and a small window that showed a square of dark sky. But the walls were solid and the stove flue from the kitchen ran through the adjacent wall so it would be warm. I meant what I said about the bolt, he said from the doorway. I know you did, she said. He started to leave. Mr. Mercer. He turned back. She was standing in the middle of the small room with the same composed expression she'd worn at the station, but something in it had shifted very slightly. Some fraction of the careful arrangement had eased. Thank you, she said, for coming to the station. Most men wouldn't have. He considered several answers. Most men would be wrong, he said finally, and pulled the door closed behind him. She was up before he was. This shouldn't have surprised him. He rose at 5 every morning, which he'd always considered early enough. But when he came downstairs the next morning at 5:05, she was already in the kitchen. The fire was going. Coffee was on. She was sitting at the table with a piece of paper and what looked like a list. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. You're out of lard, she said, and your salt stores are lower than they should be for this time of year. Do you go to town often? Once every 2 to 3 weeks. When's the next trip? End of the week, if the weather holds. She made a note on her paper. I'll have a list. He sat down and she poured him coffee without being asked, which she did with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who understood that coffee in the morning was not a gesture but a necessity. An unnecessary ceremony around necessities was a waste of everyone's time. Did you sleep? He said. Enough. She sat back down. The wind was loud, but the room was warm. I've slept worse. I don't doubt it. She looked at him over her coffee. There's something I want to say. Say it. I'm not here to be managed, she said. I'm not here to do only what I'm told and ask permission for the rest. If I see something that needs doing, I'm going to do it. If I have a better idea, I'm going to say so. If that's not the arrangement you had in mind, she left it there. He drank his coffee. What arrangement did you think I had in mind? A lot of men in your position would want someone who stays in the house and asks questions. I have Colt for questions, he said. He's full of them. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. All right then, she said, and went back to her list. Colt. The storm that had been threatening arrived that afternoon and delivered on its promises. By nightfall, it was a proper blizzard, and the ranch went quiet under it the way everything goes quiet under heavy snow. A thick, muffled silence punctuated by the wind's periodic attempts to knock something loose. Adeline had spent the day learning the ranch with a thoroughness that surprised Gideon. She didn't need to be shown anything twice. She asked the right questions, not the elementary ones, but the specific ones that revealed she was already building a mental map of how things worked and where they were weak. She asked about the weight capacity of the barn roof. She asked which fence line was most vulnerable to drifting snow. She asked how Gideon had lost the 40 cattle in February. East pasture fence came down in the night, he said. Cattle drifted south in the storm. By the time we found them, he shrugged. That's ranching. Could you have known earlier? Maybe, if I'd ridden the east fence 2 days before instead of waiting for a break in the weather. She filed this away. He could see her filing it. He wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unsettled by the systematic quality of her attention. That evening, while the storm howled and the house creaked against it, they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table and she asked him about the ranch. Not the practical facts she'd gathered during the day, but the history of it. How he'd come to Wyoming, what he'd found when he arrived, what it had cost to build what he had. He was not a man who talked easily about himself. He hadn't expected to talk at all. But she asked plainly and listened without interjecting, and somehow the story of 9 years came out of him in pieces. The first rough winter, the cattle he'd started with, the neighbor who'd tried to claim his water rights. The season 3 years in when the money ran out and he'd worked extra jobs in Mill Haven rather than sell stock. "You stayed," she said when he paused, "when most men would have cut their losses. The ranch was worth staying for. Or you were too stubborn to leave." "Probably both," he admitted. She smiled. It was brief and contained, but it was real. He hadn't been sure what her smile looked like until that moment. Outside, the storm worked its way across the prairie with the slow, systematic violence of Wyoming winter. Inside, the fire in the stove kept the kitchen honest and warm. "What did you leave behind?" he asked. "In Ohio." She was quiet for a moment. "A room I rented for 7 years," she said. "A position at a dressmaking shop. A landlady who was decent enough." A pause. "Not much that was mine." "No family?" "A brother. We don't—" She stopped. "We're not close." He didn't press it. He understood the kind of distance that grows between people over time, the kind that's less a rupture than an accumulation of small differences until one day you realize there's nothing left holding you near. "You sewed all your own clothes," he said. "Since I was 16. That coat you were wearing this morning, you made that?" "Last winter." He thought about that, the patience of it, the skill required, making something that good out of raw material. "There's mending that's been waiting 3 months," he said. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. "Tomorrow." The storm reached its peak somewhere past midnight, and the house took the full weight of it. Gideon lay awake, listening to the structure he'd built absorb the assault of wind and cold, feeling the familiar combination of worry and trust that came with being responsible for a place in weather like this. He thought about the east pasture fence. He thought about the cattle shelter he'd reinforced in October. He thought, briefly and with some difficulty to define, about the woman in the back room, her list-making and her straight spine and the brief, real quality of her smile. He decided not to think about that last part and went to sleep. 3 days later, the Bureau's man showed up. His name was Garrett, and he drove out from Mill Haven in a rented buggy that was entirely inappropriate for the road conditions after a blizzard, a fact that seemed not to have occurred to him. He appeared at the ranch at 10 in the morning, wearing a city coat and city shoes, and the expression of a man who was accustomed to having his pronouncements taken seriously. Gideon met him in the yard. "Mr. Mercer," Garrett said, climbing down from the buggy with the careful movements of someone who didn't trust the ground. "I think you know why I'm here." "I have a guess," Gideon said. "The Bureau's position is clear. Miss Rowan was evaluated and found unsuitable. By retaining her on your property, you've violated the terms of your placement agreement and put both yourself and the Bureau in a difficult position." "In what sense?" Garrett blinked. He was young, younger than he'd seemed in the telegram, with a face that was soft in ways the territory would have cured quickly if he spent more time in it. "The terms are quite specific about the placement of non-approved candidates." "She's not a candidate," Gideon said. "She's a woman who is staying as a guest of this ranch. I don't require Bureau approval to have guests." Garrett opened his mouth, closed it. "Mr. Mercer, the Bureau has relationships with the primary ranchers in this valley. Those relationships depend on—" "I know what they depend on," Gideon said. "I've had men come by already to tell me I made a mistake. I'll tell you what I told them. She's staying as long as she wants to stay. If the Bureau wants to cancel my placement agreement over that, they're welcome to." Garrett looked past him at the house, as if Adeline might appear in the doorway and resolve the situation. She didn't. "She won't last the winter," Garrett said. It came out with less authority than he'd intended. "Maybe not," Gideon said. "That's her call to make, not yours." He turned and walked back toward the barn. After a moment, he heard Garrett's buggy negotiate a slow, ungainly turn in the yard and head back toward the road. Colt appeared at the barn door. He'd been watching from inside. "He gone? For now. You think he'll be back?" "He'll send someone else with a more official letter." Gideon picked up where he'd left off on the harness he'd been mending. It won't change anything. Colt leaned against the doorframe, watching the buggy diminish into the distance. She knows, he said. Knows what? That the bureau man came. She was watching from the window. Gideon went on with the harness. Then she knows it's not a simple situation. She didn't look worried, Colt said. She looked, he searched for the word, settled, like she'd already decided something. Gideon didn't answer. He worked the leather through the buckle, tested the repair, worked it again. He thought about the word settled and found that it sat in his chest in an odd way. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Not what he'd expected to feel 3 days into an arrangement he hadn't planned on. Outside, the Wyoming sky was wide and pale and cold and completely serious, the way it always was. The horses moved in the pasture. The smoke rose from the house chimney. He went back to the harness, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do. The mending took her 2 evenings. Gideon had piled the torn and worn things in a basket by the back door over the course of 3 months. Shirts with split seams, a canvas work jacket with a tear along the shoulder, a pair of trousers where the knee had given out, Colt's vest with the missing buttons, and he'd added to the pile with the mild guilt of a man who knows a task exists but hasn't gotten around to it. He'd expected Adeline to spend a few hours on the worst of it and leave the rest. She finished everything. When he came in from the evening feeding on the second day and found the basket empty and the repaired items folded on the table, he stood looking at the pile for a moment without speaking. The jacket's a temporary fix, she said from the stove, where she was heating water. The seam allowance is gone on the left shoulder. You'll need new canvas before next winter, or it'll go again. All right. And Colt has been wearing those boots too small. His right foot especially. That's why he's been walking the way he does. Gideon hadn't noticed the way Colt walked. I'll take him to Millhaven when we go for supplies. He won't say he needs it, she said. He's at that age where asking for things feels like a weakness. I know that age, Gideon said. She looked at him briefly over her shoulder. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. That was the texture of the first weeks. Practical conversation, shared work, the gradual calibration of 2 people learning to occupy the same space without constantly colliding. Adeline moved through the ranch with a quiet efficiency that Gideon had not anticipated. She didn't wait to be assigned tasks. She identified what needed doing and did it, and if she wasn't sure of the method, she asked once and didn't need to ask again. She learned to manage the kitchen stove's temperament. It ran hot on the left side and needed constant adjustment. She learned which of the horses was skittish about the barn door and which would stand in a storm without fuss. She learned where Gideon kept the extra lamp oil and where he kept the first aid tin, and she reorganized both without asking, putting them somewhere more logical. And he noticed but didn't say anything because she was right. She made mistakes, too. She misjudged the weight of the full water barrel on the first attempt to move it herself and took the edge off her palm on the wooden frame. Nothing serious, but she'd stood in the cold with her hand in a fist until the bleeding stopped rather than say anything. He'd seen it anyway. He didn't make a production of it. He left the first aid tin on the counter where she could reach it without asking for help and went on with what he was doing. This was how they managed the awkward geography of the situation, not by talking about it, but by making small adjustments that acknowledged it without requiring either of them to say something that couldn't be unsaid. Colt watched all of this with the observational appetite of a 17-year-old who had grown up without much family and was therefore intensely interested in how other people's arrangements worked. He was careful not to stare and not quite successful at it. Adeline treated him with a matter-of-fact warmth that was neither motherly nor sentimental. She corrected his work when it needed correcting, taught him to make proper biscuits on a Tuesday afternoon when the weather kept them inside, and told him plainly when she thought his questions were stupid and when she thought they were good. He seemed to prefer this to being managed carefully. She's not what I expected, Colt told Gideon one afternoon when they were working in the barn, and Adeline was out checking the east fence line, something she'd started doing every few days, which Gideon had noticed and appreciated and said nothing about. What did you expect? Gideon said. Colt thought about it. Someone more... He looked for the word. Frightened, he said finally. Why frightened? Because of what she came from, how it went at the station. He shifted the hay fork in his hands. I figured she'd be grateful and kind of... Another pause. Small. About herself. Gideon considered this. "She's not small," he said. "No, sir." They went back to work. After a while, Colt said, "Is she staying?" "She has 3 more weeks to decide." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want her to do?" Gideon didn't answer. He moved hay and thought about the question and found that the answer was clearer than he was ready to say out loud. The town of Millhaven weighed in on the matter at the end of the second week. It started, as these things often do, with women talking, not maliciously, necessarily, but with the particular thoroughness of people who understand that other people's arrangements have implications for community standards, and community standards are worth protecting. By the time Gideon drove Adeline into town for supplies, the nature of the situation at the Mercer Ranch had moved through most of the social networks that operated out of the general store, the church, and the milliners on 2nd Street. He felt it when they walked into the general store. Not hostility exactly, nothing that obvious, but the way a conversation stopped mid-sentence and resumed at a different angle. The way Margaret Pryor, who ran the post office window at the back of the store, looked at Adeline and then at Gideon and managed to convey an entire editorial in a single expression. Adeline noticed she was not a woman who missed things, but she picked up the bolt of cloth she'd come for and examined the weave with the same focused attention she gave everything. And if the weight of being looked at bothered her, she didn't put it on display. It was at the counter, while Gideon was settling the account, that Helen Schertz spoke up. Helen was the wife of one of the valley's larger ranchers. Not the largest, but large enough to feel entitled to opinions. She was standing near the dry goods shelf, and she said, in the specific carrying tone of someone who wants to be overheard but reserves the right to claim otherwise, "I heard the bureau man drove all the way out there and couldn't get her removed." Gideon kept his eyes on the ledger. Adeline set the cloth on the counter. "The bureau agent is welcome to drive out as often as he likes," she said pleasantly, turning toward the shelf as if she were looking for something. "The road's in decent condition for this time of year." Helen blinked. She hadn't expected a direct response. "I was just saying, I know what you were saying, Mrs. Adeline looked at her with a polite inquiry. "Schertz?" Helen said, with the automatic reflex of someone who doesn't think about whether to answer. "Mrs. Schertz," Adeline said, "I don't imagine we'll have a problem between us. I'm planning to stay, the ranch is running fine, and I have a great deal of work to get back to." She picked up the cloth. "Lovely to meet you." She carried the cloth to the counter and set it down next to the other items without looking at Helen again. In the wagon on the way home, Gideon said, "That'll be talked about." "I know," Adeline said. "Helen Schertz is married to Warren Schertz, who has grazing arrangements with 4 other ranchers in the valley, including you?" she said. "Adjacent to me, yes, and the—" She was quiet for a moment. "I should have said nothing. Maybe. But I wasn't going to stand there and pretend I didn't hear it." He glanced at her. Her profile against the landscape was composed, but there was something tighter in it than usual. "I'm not criticizing," he said. "It sounded like a warning." "It was information," he said. "You can decide what to do with it." She looked at the road ahead. "I've been managing people's opinions of me since I was old enough to understand that I wasn't what they expected," she said. "Too plain, too old, too independent, too quiet, too—" She stopped. "It's a long list. I've gotten practice." He said nothing. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. "What I won't do," she said after a moment, "is make myself smaller to make someone else more comfortable. I tried that for a long time and it didn't help, and it didn't feel right." "It doesn't suit you," he said. She looked at him. "No, it doesn't." They drove the rest of the way in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The particular silence that exists between people who have said something true and don't need to add to it. The pressure came from more than one direction. 2 days after the town trip, a man named Aldous Crane rode in. He was in his mid-50s, with the confident posture of someone who'd owned enough land long enough to forget that it hadn't always been his. He ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, 3 times the size of Gideon's, and he carried the casual authority of that fact in the way he sat his horse and the way he expected you to stop what you were doing when he spoke. Gideon was repairing a section of the corral fence when Crane came in. He kept working. "Gideon," Crane said. "Aldous?" Crane looked around the ranch yard. His eyes moved to Adeline, who was near the barn door mending a length of rope with the quick, practiced motions of someone who'd learned the skill recently but was already competent at it. "I'll say my piece and be gone," Crane said, in the tone of a man who considers this a courtesy. "Go ahead," Gideon said. "The Bureau made a decision about that woman. You undermined it. Whatever you think about the Bureau, and I know you think they're a bureaucratic nuisance, they have a function in this valley. That function keeps things orderly. When one rancher decides to operate outside the arrangement, it makes things complicated for the rest of us." "In what way?" Gideon said. Crane shifted in the saddle. "The agency won't place women with ranchers in a valley where their decisions can be overridden by any man who feels like it. They'll pull out of the territory entirely." "Then they'll pull out," Gideon said. Crane's jaw tightened. "Gideon." "She came 900 miles on the agency's word," Gideon said, still working the fence post. "They evaluated her for 10 minutes and sent her back. I don't know what you call that where you come from, but out here we call it a poor way to treat a person." He drove the post home. "If the Bureau's arrangement can't survive me making a different decision on my own property, it was a fragile arrangement." Crane looked again at Adeline. She had not looked at either of them. "She won't last," he said. "People keep saying that," Gideon said. Crane gathered his reins. He was trying to hold his authority together around a man who wasn't responding to it the way most men did, and it was making him work harder than he was used to. "You're going to lose those grazing access rights on the South Ridge if Holt and I decide not to renew them," he said. "You know that." Gideon looked up at him. He held the look long enough to make it clear he'd heard the threat and was deciding what he thought of it. "Then I'll fence my own South Ridge," he said. "That's expensive, but I've paid expensive before." Crane rode out. He didn't say goodbye. Adeline had finished with the rope. She came over and held it out. A clean, even splice. "Well done." "How bad is it?" she said. "The South Ridge situation." He took the rope. "It'll cost me." "Because of me." "Because of me," he corrected. "I made the decision. Don't own what isn't yours to own." She looked at him steadily. "It is partially mine," she said. "I'm staying in your house. That makes some of the consequences mine." He wanted to argue that. He found he couldn't, quite. "All right," he said. "Partially. Can you manage it? The fencing? If I hire 2 extra hands for the spring and delay the cattle expansion, yes." She nodded. She was working the numbers the way she worked everything, directly, without flinching from what they said. "I'm good with a fence post," she said. "I know." "I can work with your extra hands in the spring. That reduces what you need to hire." He looked at the rope splice in his hands. "Clean work." "All right," he said. She went back to the barn. He stood in the yard for a moment with the rope in his hands and the cold afternoon light moving across the snow, and thought about what it meant to have someone standing next to you in a situation rather than waiting behind you to see how it turned out. It meant something. He wasn't ready to say what, exactly. The first serious test of the ranch that winter came in late January. 3 days of hard cold, not wind, but the dense, still cold that could fall below -20 and stayed there. And on the third morning, 3 of the cattle in the north pasture were in trouble. They'd pressed against the windbreak fence in a group, and one section had failed under the weight, and 2 steers and a heifer had gotten through and wandered north into a hollow that collected cold the way a bowl collects water. Gideon and Colt went after them at first light. Adeline stood in the yard as they rode out and said nothing, but when they hadn't returned by mid-morning, she saddled the spare horse, the bay mare that she'd been learning on, with more competence than either of them had expected, and rode north. She found them on the second try. The hollow was on the wrong side of a ridge she hadn't known about, and she spent 40 minutes covering ground that looked right but wasn't, before she came down the north side of the ridge and found Gideon and Colt with the 3 cattle in a loose, unhappy group. One of the steers had gone down and was refusing to get up. "He needs to move," Gideon said when she arrived. His voice was flat with controlled frustration. "He gets cold enough down there, he won't get up at all." "How long has he been down?" "Maybe 20 minutes. Adeline dismounted. She tied the mare and walked to the steer with a directness that made both Gideon and Colt watch her. She wasn't a large woman, and the steer outweighed her by a factor of perhaps 8, but she positioned herself at his hindquarters, assessed the situation with the expression of someone solving a problem rather than confronting an animal, and began to push. The steer didn't move. She pushed harder. Nothing. You need to get him angry, she said. Not scared, angry. How? Colt started. She slapped the steer on the flank, hard, with the flat of her palm. Once, twice, a third time, each one sharp and deliberate. The steer's head came up. She kept at it. She made noise, a sharp percussive sound without words, and she put her shoulder into his hindquarters, and the steer scrambled to his feet with the offended indignation of an animal that has decided being horizontal is no longer acceptable. Keep him moving, she said, stepping back and picking up her reins. Don't let him stop. They drove all 3 cattle back to the main herd. The steer complained about the whole enterprise at volume, which was fine. Complaint meant he was warm enough to have opinions. Back at the barn, once the cattle were secure and the horses seen to, Colt looked at Adeline with an expression he wasn't trying to hide. Where'd you learn that? He said. My brother had a dairy farm for 3 years, she said, before it went under. She was checking the bay mare's hooves, her back to them. Cows are cows. Gideon was hanging up the tack. He didn't say anything, but he filed away the information about the brothers' farm with everything else he was slowly accumulating about who Adeline Rowan was, and where she'd come from, and what it had cost her to get here. That evening, she made soup from the last of the ham bone and dried vegetables, and they ate together in the kitchen with the fire going hard against the cold outside. Colt fell asleep in his chair before he'd finished eating, which was something he did occasionally when the days were long and the work was physical, and neither of them woke him. Gideon refilled his coffee. Adeline was darning one of Colt's socks with the automatic concentration of someone whose hands know the work well enough to let her mind wander. Your 30 days is almost up, he said. She kept darning. I know. You don't have to decide tonight, he said. This isn't pressure. I wanted you to know I hadn't forgotten. She set down the sock and looked at him. In the firelight, she looked less composed than she usually did. Not distressed, but more present somehow, less managed. I don't need the full 30 days, she said. He waited. I'm staying, she said. If the offer still holds. It holds. She picked the sock back up. Colt snored once and shifted in his chair without waking. Outside, the cold was doing what cold did in Wyoming in January, asserting itself completely, filling every space that wasn't defended against it. Why? Gideon said. She looked up again. Why am I staying? Yes. She thought about it, not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. Because it's real, she said finally. The work is real, the problems are real, the land is real. When I do something here, it matters. When I fix something, it stays fixed. She paused. That might sound simple. It doesn't sound simple at all, he said. She went back to the sock. He watched the fire for a while. The wind outside had found its way around the corner of the house and was testing the east-facing wall. For what it's worth, he said, without looking at her, the ranch runs better with you here. That's a factual statement. She didn't look up. That's a practical way to say something, she said. I'm a practical man. I noticed, she said. And then after a moment in a voice that had something different in it, quieter, less arranged. Thank you for saying it. He nodded. He went back to his coffee. The fire settled. Colt slept. It was ordinary. It was just the kitchen and the cold and 2 people in the particular proximity of shared work and shared difficulty, and ordinary was the word for it. But ordinary can change what it means over time. Gideon knew this the way he knew most things, not from being told, but from paying attention. The same fence line looks different in every season. The same stretch of land is a different thing in drought and in thaw. Nothing that matters stays exactly what it started as. He thought about this, and the fire burned down, and the night outside moved through its hours toward morning. February arrived with the indifference of something that doesn't need to try. The work of the ranch in deep winter is less visible than the work of other seasons, but not less demanding. There's no planting, no branding, no harvest, just the ongoing management of cold and feed and animal health and equipment that fails in the wrong temperature at the wrong time. The days have a grinding sameness to them, which is its own test of character. You find out who someone is in February in Wyoming. Not during a crisis, but during a Tuesday that looks exactly like the Monday before it and the Wednesday that will follow. Adeline found her rhythm. It wasn't the rhythm she'd started with. It had been refined by weeks of actual ranch work, which is different from imagined ranch work in every particular. Her hands had changed. Her posture had changed. She'd stopped holding herself with the careful economy of a woman managing limited space and started moving through the ranch with the straightforwardness of someone who had enough room. She and Gideon argued twice in February. The first time was about the cattle rotation. She thought the south herd should be moved earlier in the month to avoid the feed competition near the water source, and he thought the timing was fine. He was wrong, and she was right, and it took 4 days and some clearly spooked cattle near the water trough for him to admit it. "You could have said I told you so," he said when he told her he'd been wrong. "I considered it," she said. "I decided against it." "Why?" "Because you admitted it yourself," she said. "You don't need me to add anything to that." The second argument was about the roof of the barn's west section, which had a soft spot she'd identified and he'd assessed as manageable until spring. She thought waiting was a mistake. He thought she was overcorrecting. They had the argument in the barn in 35-degree air, both of them practical and neither of them willing to be immediately wrong, and they came to an uneasy compromise that involved him checking the spot again after the next heavy snow, and her being right to push when the check confirmed what she'd said. It wasn't that they didn't get along. They did, increasingly, in the way that people get along when they're working toward the same thing and trust each other's competence. But they were both people who had opinions and were accustomed to acting on them, and that created occasional friction that was not always comfortable and occasionally was almost useful. Colt observed all of this with the quiet attention of someone who understands more than he's given credit for. One evening when Adeline had gone to her room and Gideon was sitting with his account books, Colt came in from the bunkhouse for a cup of coffee. Something he did more often lately, Gideon had noticed, since there were consistently better things to drink in the main house than in the bunkhouse, and stood at the counter for a moment. "She's not leaving," he said. "No," Gideon said, without looking up. "I mean, she's not leaving ever," Colt said. Gideon looked up at that. Colt shrugged with the elaborate casualness of 17. "Just something I noticed," he said, and took his coffee back to the bunkhouse. Gideon sat with the account books and the fire and the particular quality of quiet that a house has when it contains more people than it used to, and he thought about what Colt had said, and he thought about what he himself had been noticing for several weeks, building up in the spaces around the practical facts of shared work and daily difficulty. He wasn't ready to call it what it was. He was, however, beginning to run out of other things to call it. Outside, the February cold pressed against the walls of the house with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. Inside, the fire held against it. That was what you did out here. You held against what came at you, and you held better when you weren't holding alone. He went back to the accounts. The numbers were better than they'd been this time last year. Not dramatically, but measurably, in the way that real improvements show up. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small things that finally add up to something you can point to and say, "This is different now. This is better." He wrote down the figures. He did not write down the reason, which was more complicated than the ledger had room for. March came in sideways. That was the only way to describe it. Not a gradual change, not a softening of the cold, but a lateral shift in the quality of the weather that brought freezing rain instead of snow, ice instead of dry cold, and a gray sky that sat on the valley like a lid on a pot. The ranch work continued because it had to. The cattle didn't care what month it was. The fences didn't care. The feed situation, which had been tight since the second week of February, cared very much. And it occupied most of Gideon's thinking as March settled in with its particular brand of misery. He'd been right about the South Ridge access. Crane had not renewed the grazing rights as threatened, and Gideon had spent the back half of February sourcing materials for the additional fencing and calculating how he'd pay for it without selling stock ahead of the spring price improvement. The numbers were not good, but they were not impossible, and he'd lived inside not good but not impossible numbers before and knew how to operate there. What he hadn't anticipated was Crane moving faster than expected. Word came through Colt, who heard it at the feed supplier in Mill Haven on a supply run. Crane had been talking to the other valley ranchers about organizing a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Office regarding water rights on the creek that ran through the north corner of Gideon's property. It wasn't a new dispute. There'd been loose talk about the creek's upper watershed for years, but Crane had given it structure now, filed paperwork, and was quietly assembling signatures from ranchers who owed him favors or feared his displeasure. Gideon heard this on a Thursday evening. He sat with it through Friday without saying much. Adeline noticed, she noticed most things, but she waited. She'd learned that he processed things in silence before he was ready to talk about them, and she didn't push. On Saturday morning, she came to the barn where he was working with a length of fencing wire and a pair of pliers, doing the kind of repetitive physical work that men use to give their hands something to do while their minds work through a problem. "Tell me about the creek," she said. He set down the pliers. "You heard?" "Colt told me last night. He thought I should know." She leaned against the barn door. "How bad is it?" He picked the pliers back up, turned them over in his hands. "If Crane gets the land office to reclassify the upper watershed as shared access, I lose priority rights to the north pasture water. That pasture runs 40 head in summer. Without reliable water, I either sell those 40 head or spend money I don't have trucking water in." "How many signatures does he need?" 3 neighboring rights holders for a formal challenge. He's got Holt already. He needs 2 more. "Who are the others he's approaching?" He looked at her. "You're mapping this." "Yes," she said, without apology. He set the pliers down for good and gave her the names. 4 ranchers Crane might approach, their relationships to Crane, their histories with the water rights question. She listened with the focused stillness that he'd come to understand meant she was building something in her mind, some structure that would let her see the problem from all sides. "The 2 most likely are Patterson and Decker," she said when he'd finished. "Patterson because Crane holds a note on his east pasture. Decker because he's wanted that upper watershed access himself for years, and this gives him cover to push for it without being the one who started it." "That's right. So you need to talk to Patterson and Decker before Crane does." "Patterson's already been approached. He told Elias Webb over at the grain exchange he was thinking it over." She was quiet a moment. "What does Patterson actually need?" Gideon looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Crane holds a note on his east pasture. That's leverage. If someone could relieve that leverage or offer something that matters more to Patterson than keeping Crane happy." She left the sentence open. "I'm not in a position to buy out Patterson's debt," Gideon said. "That's a significant sum. I'm not suggesting you buy it out. I'm suggesting you find out what Patterson actually wants and whether it's something you have." She pushed off the door. "People don't always want what they're being offered. They want what they actually need, and sometimes those are different things." He watched her walk back toward the house. He thought about Patterson, a rancher in his mid-60s who'd been talking for 2 years about wanting to reduce his herd rather than expand it, who'd mentioned once to Gideon's knowledge a desire to retire his branding equipment and let a younger family take on the northeast section of his property. He thought about the spring cattle Gideon had been planning to acquire, a purchase he'd been considering from a seller in the next county. He thought about what Patterson might want more than debt pressure from Crane. He went back to the house and wrote a letter. He didn't tell Adeline what he'd written. She didn't ask. This was part of the arrangement between them. She offered what she saw, and what he did with it was his decision. She was not interested in receiving credit for things, and she was not interested in managing him. She'd been clear about this from the beginning, and he'd come to rely on it the way you rely on a straight edge for measuring. It told you the truth without wanting anything from you for telling it. The meeting with Patterson happened the following Tuesday, at the man's ranch, over coffee that tasted like it had been made before Patterson's wife stopped him from making his own coffee. Gideon sat across from Patterson in a kitchen that had the look of a place where energy was being conserved, things not replaced when they wore out, habits not maintained the way they once were. Patterson was 63 and looked it, and the ranch had the subtle downward slope of something running on momentum rather than active effort. Gideon made his offer. It was not large and it was not complicated. He would buy the northeast section of Patterson's property, the section Patterson had been wanting to offload for 2 years, at a fair price, payable partly in cattle at spring market value. The purchase would give Patterson enough to retire the Crane note and reduce his operational commitment to a manageable level. Patterson was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee cup. "Crane's not going to like this," he said. "No," Gideon said. "He'll find other ways to make things difficult." "Probably," Gideon said. Patterson looked up at him. He was a man who'd spent his life being practical about hard facts, and he recognized that quality in other people. "You're not afraid of him," Patterson said. "I'm cautious of him." "That's different from afraid." Another silence. Then, "My wife's been wanting to go visit her sister in Denver since last fall. She hasn't said so, but I can tell. A woman who wants to leave her kitchen for a while stops rearranging it. Gideon nodded. He said nothing. If I sell you the northeast section, Patterson said slowly, I'm out from under Crane's note. I've got money to make the trip to Denver, and I'm not involved in this water rights business. That's right. And you acquire land you probably can use. It buffers my north pasture and gives me better road access to the east fence. Yes. Patterson drank his bad coffee. Let me talk to my wife, he said. Gideon drove home. 2 days later, Patterson sent a letter agreeing to the terms. Decker, without Patterson's backing, quietly removed himself from Crane's list. The formal water rights challenge was never filed. Crane heard about it within a week. He did not come in person this time. He sent a message through Warren Shirts, the same Warren whose wife Helen had made her opinion known in the general store. And the message was not a threat exactly, more an editorial, suggesting that Gideon was spending money he couldn't afford on a piece of land he didn't need out of stubbornness that would eventually cost him more than it saved. Gideon read the message, set it on the kitchen table, and went back to work. Adeline read it when she came in for the midday meal. She put it back where it had been and said nothing until they were eating, and then, he's not wrong that it's expensive. No, Gideon said, but he's wrong about the reason. Yes. She looked at him across the table. It wasn't stubbornness. No, he said. It was strategy. He's just not accustomed to other people having one. She said nothing more. But that evening when she thought he wasn't watching, she read the message a second time, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite name, something that mixed satisfaction with a kind of tiredness, the look of someone who's been fighting a slow fight for long enough that a small victory lands differently than a decisive one. He understood that. He was feeling something similar. The confrontation with Crane himself came in early April, in the most public setting possible, the spring livestock auction at the Millhaven Fairgrounds, where every rancher in the valley came to buy, sell, and perform their social relationships in front of witnesses. Gideon and Adeline drove in together, as they'd been doing for weeks. It had stopped being remarkable to Gideon. It had not stopped being remarkable to everyone who saw them, and the fairgrounds amplified that. There were perhaps 60 people at the auction, ranchers, hands, merchants, wives, and Adeline's presence at Gideon's side was observed by most of them with various configurations of opinion. She dressed with care that morning without making a point of it. The green wool coat, cleaned and brushed, and a gray dress she'd made herself from the fabric she'd bought in February. She looked like what she was, a woman who made her own things well. She did not look like someone who had been sent back. The auction went normally for the first 2 hours. Gideon bought a pair of 2-year-old steers and passed on a lot of yearling heifers that were priced too high for their condition. Adeline stood beside him during the bidding, watching the animals come through with the assessing attention she brought to everything on the ranch. Twice she leaned in and said something quietly, once about the heifers confirming his assessment, once about a draft horse that was being undersold because of a cosmetic issue that didn't affect its working capacity. He didn't bid on the horse. He thought about it afterward and considered that he probably should have. Crane was at the auction with 2 of his men. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a room, which, at an event like this, was a performance as much as a fact. He nodded to people. He shook hands. He accepted deference without appearing to notice it. He got to Gideon just after noon, near the fence line where the purchased cattle were being held. Gideon, he said. Aldous. Crane looked at Adeline the way he'd looked at her in the ranch yard months ago, as if she were a detail in the landscape rather than a person who might look back. I heard about the Patterson deal, he said. I expect you did, Gideon said. Smart, Crane said, and something in his tone managed to make the word sound like its opposite. But expensive. He looked at Adeline directly then, a slow, deliberate look. I imagine you're behind that kind of thinking. Women who've managed on limited means have a particular relationship with complicated schemes. The words were measured, not shouted, not crude, the specific register of a man who knows how to say something cutting in a voice that could be described afterward as conversational. Several people nearby had gone quiet. Adeline looked at him. She was very still the way she got when she was deciding something. The strategy was Gideon's, she said. Her voice was pleasant and clear and carried without effort. I noticed the problem. He solved it. That's generally how useful partnerships work, Mr. Crane. Crane smiled. The smile of a man who is about to say something he has prepared. Useful partnerships. That's a thoughtful way to describe a situation the Bureau of Placement found unsuitable, and most of this valley finds unconventional. The Bureau found me unsuitable, she said. Not the partnership. I was unsuitable because I'm 34 years old and they had a preference for younger women. That's their preference. It's not a fact about my capabilities. She held his gaze without effort. As for the Valley's opinion, I noticed the people most invested in that opinion are the ones whose arrangements with you depend on other people doing what they're told. A silence opened up. Crane's smile didn't disappear, but it lost some of its comfort. You've been on this land for what, 5 months? He said. You're speaking very confidently about how this valley works. I've been listening for 5 months, she said. I find it's usually enough. Someone nearby coughed, the cough of a person suppressing something. Crane was working to maintain the authority that a man like him depended on in public, and he was working visibly, which was unusual for him. I understand you've been helping Gideon with his books, he said. Notice some irregularities in the South Ridge grazing records. It was a pivot, deliberate, meant to destabilize. Adeline's expression didn't shift. There are no irregularities in the grazing records, she said. What there are is 18 months of data showing that Crane cattle has been running stock on the South Ridge Commons without calculating the full access fee to the shared grazing fund. The discrepancy works out to approximately $340 at the standard rate. She paused. I assumed it was an oversight. I have the ledger entries at home if you'd like to review them. The silence after this was different from the one before. Crane looked at her. He was recalibrating. She could see him doing it, adjusting from dismissal to something more careful, which was a kind of admission in itself. That figure is, he started, verifiable, she said. The grazing fund minutes are public record at the county office. I can walk you through the calculation if it would help. Gideon had said nothing during any of this. He'd been watching Crane and watching Adeline with equal attention. He knew the grazing records. He'd been aware of the discrepancy and had filed it away as one of those things you know about a powerful neighbor and don't use unless you have to. He hadn't told Adeline about it directly. She'd found it herself, in his records and the public documents she'd apparently been studying with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. She had not told him she'd found it. She'd held it until it was needed. Crane looked at Gideon. Is this? He started. It's accurate, Gideon said. I've seen the records. She's right. Another pause. This could be settled quietly, Crane said. It can, Adeline said. The fund administrator is Roy Elster. He's over by the cattle pens. She looked in that direction with a mild helpfulness that was the most pointed thing he'd seen her do. Shall I walk you over? Crane did not take her up on the offer. He excused himself with the careful dignity of a man who has taken a worse hit than he's showing and is determined not to show it to the audience that is assembled around them. He settled with the grazing fund 6 days later, the full amount, no negotiation. Walking back to the wagon after the auction, Gideon was quiet for a block and a half. Then he said, You found that on your own? Yes, Adeline said, and you held it. I wasn't sure I'd need it. I hoped I wouldn't. He thought about this. Why didn't you tell me? She considered her answer. Because if I'd told you, you'd have either used it earlier, when the timing was wrong, or you'd have been the one to use it today, and the message would have been different. What was the message? That I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be, she said. That I'm here because I chose it, and I'm capable, and the valley can adjust its opinion accordingly. He was quiet. Was that wrong? She said. There was something careful in her voice. Not uncertainty exactly, but an awareness that she'd acted independently in a situation that affected him. No, he said. It wasn't wrong. He helped her up to the wagon seat. It was right, actually. I wouldn't have done it as well. She looked at him. You'd have done it differently. Not as well, he repeated. They drove out of Millhaven into the spring afternoon, which was cold still, but with a different quality to it. The cold of something winding down rather than something building. The auction crowd diminished behind them. The valley opened up. People will talk about this, she said after a while. They were already talking. This is different. This is me standing up to Aldous Crane in public. Some people will respect that. Some people won't. Some of the ones who won't respect it will pretend to, he said, because Crane's authority just took a visible dent. She was quiet for a moment, watching the road. I don't want people to be afraid of me, she said. That's not what I was going for. I know. But when you show that a powerful man is smaller than he looked, some people are afraid of the person who showed it. He glanced at her. They get over it. She nodded slowly. She was processing the afternoon the way she processed everything, thoroughly, not rushing to conclusions. You weren't afraid of him, Gideon said. I was a little afraid of him, she said. My hands were shaking when he turned toward me. I don't know if you noticed. He hadn't noticed. You didn't show it. No, but I felt it. She folded her hands in her lap with a deliberateness that suggested she was feeling their steadiness now. I've been afraid of losing things before. Afraid of being sent away or found lacking or taking up too much space. She paused. Out here, I've noticed I'm less afraid of those things. I don't know if it's the place or the... She stopped. Or the what? He said. She looked out at the landscape. The company, she said quietly. He didn't say anything to that, but he kept his eyes on the road, and something in his chest settled differently than it had been sitting all morning. The blizzard came without sufficient warning. Late April in Wyoming is theoretically spring, but the territory hadn't read the almanac, and what arrived on the 23rd of the month was a storm that the oldest ranchers in the valley would discuss for years afterward. Not the worst ever, but the worst in recent memory, which is the kind of record that counts most practically. It started as rain, turned to sleet by midday, and was full snow by nightfall. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. By morning, the drifts along the fence lines were chest high, and the wind was working across the open ground in sustained gusts that made travel without a rope line dangerous. They'd gotten most of the cattle to the sheltered south pasture the evening before, when the weather started going wrong in a way that experienced ranchers recognized. They hadn't gotten all of them. 12 head were still on the east pasture, the same vulnerable stretch that had cost Gideon 40 cattle 2 winters ago. And the east pasture fence that Adeline had been worried about since February had taken damage in the night that Gideon discovered at first light. He told Adeline and Colt what they were dealing with over a breakfast none of them ate much of. The cattle needed to be found and moved. The fence needed emergency repair to prevent further drift. Both things needed to happen before the second wave of the storm arrived, which the sky was making clear would be before noon. I'll take the fence, Adeline said. Gideon looked at her. The east fence is exposed. Wind's coming directly from the... I know where the wind's coming from, she said. Colt should go with you to find the cattle. You'll need 2 people to move 12 head in this. I can manage a fence repair. It's not... He stopped. He'd been going to say it's not safe, which was true, but also true of everything they were about to do, and she knew that as well as he did. You know the repair? You showed me the kit in the fall, she said. I've watched you do it twice. Tell me what I need, and I'll get it done, he told her. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 specific questions, and went to get her coat. They split up in the yard. The storm hit them immediately. Not dramatic, just total, the kind of cold that gets into everything and stays there. Gideon watched Adeline head for the barn and the supplies, and he made himself turn toward the east pasture rather than follow her. The cattle search took 2 hours. They found 11 of the 12. 1 heifer they couldn't locate, and Gideon made the decision to stop searching before the second wave hit, rather than lose people to find an animal. It was the right call. It was still a loss. Getting the 11 back was its own operation in deteriorating visibility, and by the time they reached the south pasture, both Gideon and Colt were moving with the careful slowness of men running on the last of their cold reserves. Gideon's left hand, the one missing the fingertip, had gone numb in a way that was familiar and required attention. They came back to the ranch yard in the full teeth of the second wave. He saw the east fence line from a distance. It was standing. She'd repaired it, not perfectly. He could see 2 sections that would need additional work in better weather, but standing and functional and enough to hold. She'd done it in the middle of a blizzard with a repair kit and the memory of watching him work, and it was standing. He went to the barn first with Colt because the horses needed to come before anything else. And when he came out, Adeline was crossing the yard toward the house through the driving snow. She was moving stiffly, The particular stiffness of someone who's been working in extreme cold long enough that the cold has gotten into their muscles, and she was carrying the repair kit in one hand, and there was something wrong with the way she was moving. He got to her in a few steps. "What happened?" "I'm fine," she said automatically. "What happened?" She stopped. Up close, her face was windburned, and the cold had done something to her expression. Stripped the management off it, left it unguarded. "I slipped on the ice at the second post," she said. "Came down on my knee. It's not... I can walk, so it's not broken." "Let me... I can walk," she said again, with more energy than she probably had, because she was cold and in pain, and had just spent 2 hours in a blizzard alone fixing something that needed fixing, and she was not going to be carried. He understood that. He didn't try to take her arm. He walked beside her instead, close enough that if she needed something to balance against, it was there without being offered. Inside, the kitchen was warm. Colt appeared shortly after and took one look at the situation and went to put more wood in the stove without being asked. Adeline sat down at the kitchen table and took her coat off, and Gideon could see her hands shaking. The real kind of shaking, not nerves, but cold working its way out. And he heated water and made her drink something hot before he looked at the knee, which she allowed with the resigned acceptance of someone who has decided that maintaining her independence and accepting basic first aid are not actually in conflict. The knee was badly bruised. Not broken, as she'd said. It would be painful and stiff for a week. It was the kind of injury that could have been worse and wasn't, through no particular grace, but through the random arithmetic of how people fall. She sat with her hands wrapped around a mug and the storm doing its full performance outside and said, "The fence is standing." "I saw," he said. "2 sections need work when the weather clears. The northwest corner post is deeper in the drift than I could access today." "Adeline, I want to tell you about it while I remember the details," she said. "My knee is fine. Tell me about the cattle." He told her. She absorbed the loss of the heifer with the expression of someone who has learned to take losses without dramatizing them. 11 out of 12 in those conditions, she said. "That's good," he said. "Yes." She looked at her mug. Something was happening in her face, not quite the composure he was used to, but something working through the composure, finding the edges of it. The cold, the pain, the hours alone in the storm, things accumulate and then find a way out, usually at the moment when the immediate crisis is over and the body understands it's allowed to. "I was worried about you," she said. It came out direct and unmanaged, which was different from how she usually said things. "Out there with the cattle in the second wave, you were gone longer than—" She stopped. He was sitting across from her. He looked at her, really looked, the way you look at something you've been keeping in your peripheral vision for a while and have finally turned toward. "We're all back," he said. "I know." She looked up. "I know we are. I just—" She shook her head once, which was her version of acknowledging that the feeling had surprised her. "I'm not used to having people to worry about." He said nothing. He let that sit between them without covering it with something easier. After a while she said, more quietly, "I think I'm in trouble." "You're neat." "That's not what I mean," she said. The fire in the stove moved. The storm threw a fresh gust at the north wall. Colt was in the bunkhouse, which was where you went when you understood something was happening that didn't include you. Gideon looked at the woman across the table, at the wind-burned face and the steady eyes and the working hands that were finally still around the mug, and said, "I know what you mean." She looked at him. She didn't ask if he was sure or qualify it or manage it back into something safer. She just looked at him with the direct quality that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her on a bench in a cold train station, and she nodded once. Outside, the storm ran its course, and inside the house, something that had been moving toward its conclusion since the beginning arrived there, quietly, without ceremony, in a warm kitchen at the end of a difficult day. The knee healed in 10 days, which was faster than Gideon expected, and exactly as fast as Adeline had decided it would. She didn't rest it the way he would have preferred. She modified what she did. She didn't ride, she didn't climb, she didn't do the things that put direct strain on the joint. But she kept working, and she moved through the ranch with a careful deliberateness that was less about limitation than about adaptation. By the 5th day, she was walking without the pronounced stiffness. By the 8th, she was back on the bay mare in the south pasture. checking the fence lines she'd been unable to get to during the storm recovery. He watched this without comment. He'd learned by now when to say something and when saying something would be received as interference rather than concern. With Adeline, the line between those two things was specific, and she was not shy about indicating when he'd crossed it. What had shifted between them after the storm, what she'd said at the kitchen table, and what he'd said in response to it, had not immediately changed the surface texture of their daily arrangement. They still ate at the same table. They still discussed the ranch in the practical language of people responsible for the same operation. Colt still moved through the kitchen with his coffee and his 17-year-old observational appetite, though he'd developed a new quality of tact that suggested he understood more about what was happening than he'd been told. The difference was quieter than that. It lived in smaller things. The way Gideon stayed in the kitchen in the evenings now rather than going to the barn a second time on the pretext of checking the horses. The way Adeline had stopped prefacing her opinions about ranch decisions with qualifiers. She'd stopped saying I might be wrong, or it's not my place to say, and had started saying what she thought in the direct register of someone who knew her perspective was wanted. Small adjustments. The kind that don't announce themselves but accumulate into something recognizable over time. It was Gideon who finally moved the situation out of the place where it had been waiting. He did it badly. He'd have been the first to admit that. It was a Sunday afternoon in early May, the first genuinely warm day of the year, one of those spring days on the Wyoming range that arrive like an apology for everything winter did, and deliver on it. Blue sky reaching in every direction, the grass coming back green in the low ground, the horses moving with a looseness they didn't have in cold weather. Adeline was on the porch repairing a leather harness that had finally given out along the brow band, and he came and stood at the porch rail and looked at the land for a while without saying what he'd come to say. "You're doing the thing you do," she said without looking up. "What thing?" "When you have something to say and you're working up to it, you go quiet and you look at something that's not what you're thinking about." He turned and looked at her. She was still working the leather, but the corner of her mouth had the thing it did, the slight movement that was adjacent to a smile without committing to one. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know. About what you said, during the storm." She set the harness down now. She looked at him with the direct quality he'd come to depend on, the quality that meant she was not going to manage what she felt for his convenience. "I haven't been thinking about it," he said. "I mean, I have, but not the way you'd think about a problem. I've been—" He stopped. He was not a man who had practice with this particular kind of conversation, and it showed. "I don't know how to say this cleanly." "Then say it uncleanly," she said. He put his hands on the porch rail. "I don't want this to be a 30-day arrangement that turned into a longer arrangement that we never formally decided on," he said. "I don't want you to stay because it's practical, or because leaving is complicated, or because—" He stopped again. "I want you to know why I'm asking before I ask, because I don't want you to say yes for the wrong reasons." She was very still. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because it's what comes next, or because the Valley expects it, or because the bureau arrangement needs to be formalized. I'm asking because—" He pushed off the rail and turned to face her fully. "Because I don't know how to imagine this place or this life without you in it anymore. And I've tried, and I can't do it, and that seems like a thing worth saying clearly." Adeline looked at him for a long moment. The spring afternoon moved around them, the warm air, the sound of the horses in the south pasture, the particular brightness that comes in May when the sky is clean. "You said that very uncleanly," she said. "I know. You stumbled over it in at least 3 places. I'm aware." "It was the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. He waited. "Yes," she said, "for the same reason. Because I can't imagine it without you either. And I've been trying not to think about what that means for 2 months, and I'm tired of not thinking about it." He came up onto the porch. He sat down beside her on the bench, not taking her hand, not performing anything, just sitting close in the way of 2 people who have been near each other for months and now have permission to close the remaining distance. She went back to the harness for a moment and then set it down again and looked at the land. "When?" she said. "Whenever you want." "Simple?" "As simple as you like." She was quiet a moment. "I don't want a production," she said. "I've watched women plan ceremonies around their happiness, and somehow the ceremony becomes the thing they're managing instead. I'd rather just—" She paused. "Do the actual thing, with the actual people. Colt, he said, and whoever else you need. That might be just Colt. Then just Colt, she said. The wedding happened on a Saturday in the third week of May, at the ranch, with a justice of the peace named Harlan Briggs, who drove out from Millhaven and charged $4 for the service and shook both their hands with the workmanlike sincerity of a man who performed marriages the way other men laid brick, doing it properly because doing it sloppily would be wrong, not because the occasion required theater. Colt wore his good shirt and stood beside Gideon with the careful dignity of someone who understood the weight of being the only witness and was taking it seriously. He'd polished his boots. Gideon noticed and said nothing. Adeline wore the gray dress, the one she'd made herself, and she'd added something to the collar. A small piece of cream-colored fabric worked into a careful tuck that she'd done herself the previous evening. Gideon noticed this too and didn't say anything about it either, but he thought about it. The quality of attention she brought to everything turned toward this moment in the specific way she brought it to things that mattered. Briggs read the words. They said the things that needed to be said. The afternoon was warm and clear, and the horses in the south pasture moved in the background like an audience that had been there all along. Afterward, Colt shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Adeline and appeared to think about something for a moment and then hugged her, briefly, with the abrupt decisiveness of someone who makes up their mind and acts before they can talk themselves out of it. She hugged him back. "All right," Colt said, stepping back and looking at the middle distance with the pink-faced composure of a 17-year-old who has performed an emotion and survived. "I'll put dinner on." He went inside. Briggs' buggy raised a small cloud of dust down the road. Gideon and Adeline stood in the yard in the May afternoon. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She looked at the ranch, at the barn, and the fences, and the house, and the land behind it, all of it hers now in a legal sense it hadn't been an hour ago, though it had been hers in the practical sense for months. "It's a lot of work," she said. "It is." "The south pasture fence still needs that third post reset." "Monday," he said. "And the barn roof." "Monday," he said again. She looked at him. The smile was there, the real one. The brief and genuine version that he'd first seen in February and had been cataloging since. "Monday," she agreed. The Valley's response to the marriage was various. Patterson sent a note of congratulations that read like a man who was genuinely pleased and also slightly relieved that the whole situation had resolved into something conventional enough to support. Webb at the grain exchange shook Gideon's hand when he came in for supplies and said, with the gruff brevity of a man who means more than he says, "Good woman." Helen Schertz made a point of calling on Adeline the following week, which was either a social capitulation or the beginning of genuine curiosity, or both, and which Adeline received with the same courteous directness she brought to everything, neither forgiving the earlier hostility in so many words nor holding it against her, just moving forward as if they were starting from now. Crane said nothing at all, which was its own statement. The women who mattered, the ones who did real work and understood what the ranch life actually required, came to their own conclusions about Adeline over the spring and summer, conclusions drawn not from the marriage itself, but from what they observed when they saw her work. Martha Decker, whose husband had quietly removed himself from Crane's water rights campaign, came out in June ostensibly to return a borrowed pot, and stayed 3 hours watching Adeline manage a difficult situation with one of the mares who'd developed a leg problem. She went home and told 2 people that the Mercer woman knew what she was doing, which in the currency of that community was worth considerably more than approval. What the spring became, and then the summer, was work. The specific, unglamorous, necessary work of a ranch that had expanded beyond its previous scope and needed to justify that expansion through production. The Patterson land required new fencing along its northern boundary, which Gideon and Colt and 2 seasonal hands did through June. The cattle herd needed reorganization to account for the new grazing rotation, which Adeline managed with the methodical intelligence she brought to all logistics problems. The water situation that Crane had tried to weaponize ended up working in their favor when the late spring rains were generous to the north pasture and sparse in the south, which made Gideon's water rights more valuable to his neighbors rather than less. None of this was easy. The new fencing cost more in labor than he'd projected. One of the seasonal hands lasted 3 weeks before deciding ranching wasn't his occupation. The bay mare's leg problem turned out to be more serious than it had first appeared and required months of rest, which disrupted the riding rotation and added work to everyone else. The summer was too hot in July, and the water in the East Creek ran lower than usual, and for 3 weeks in August, Gideon was calculating feed costs against water availability with the kind of focus that doesn't leave room for much else. Through all of it, what changed was not that things became easier. They didn't, but that the weight of them was distributed differently. He stopped carrying the accounting of every problem in his own head, alone, the way he'd been doing for 9 years. He started saying things at dinner that he would previously have sat with until they resolved or failed to resolve. The feed cost numbers, the fencing timetable, the question of whether to take on a third seasonal hand in September or wait until spring. She engaged with these things the way she'd always engaged with ranch problems, directly, without sentiment, with the focus of someone who understood that the right answer mattered more than being agreeable. She was not always right. Neither was he. They argued about the September hand, and she was right. They argued about the East Creek water, and he was right. They argued about selling a group of yearlings in late August, and neither of them was fully right, which produced an outcome that was imperfect and manageable, which is usually what outcomes are. Colt turned 18 in September, and Gideon gave him a raise and a formal designation as lead hand, which the boy received with the composed pride of someone who had been working towards something and was not surprised to receive it but was moved anyway. Adeline made him a cake with the limited available materials, and it was dense and slightly lopsided, and he ate 3 pieces. "You're going to leave eventually," Adeline said to him that evening. It was not a challenge, just a true thing said plainly. Colt looked at her. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're 18 and you're smart, and this valley isn't the only place that exists." He was quiet for a moment. "I like it here," he said. "I know you do. And you can like a place and also know there are other places." He thought about this. "Where did you come from?" he said. "Before? Ohio, a small town, a rented room, and a dressmaking position." "Did you like it?" "Parts of it," she said. "Not enough." Colt looked at his plate. "I think I want to see more of the territory," he said. "Before I'm old enough that staying feels easier than going." "Then go when you're ready," she said. "The ranch will still be here." Gideon said nothing during this exchange. He was listening to it with the specific attention he brought to things that told him something he needed to know. He'd understood for a while that Colt was outgrowing the ranch, not because the ranch wasn't worthy of him, but because he was at the age when outgrowing things is the point. He hadn't known how to say so. Adeline had said it for him, in the specific way she had of making difficult truths easier to receive by saying them without performance. He thought about the fact that she did this, and what it said about who she was, and it was not the first time he'd thought about it. In October, a letter came from the Continental Placement Bureau. It was addressed to Gideon, which was how their correspondence always came, because they did not acknowledge Adeline except as an administrative problem that had resolved itself in an unsatisfactory fashion. The letter was from a man named Whitmore, who had replaced Garrett in the regional role, and it was written with the tone of an organization that has decided to treat an unpleasant situation as a precedent-setting opportunity. The Bureau, Whitmore wrote, had reviewed the situation at the Mercer Ranch and concluded that Mr. Mercer's decision to retain a non-approved placement candidate had violated the terms of his agreement with the Bureau. While the subsequent marriage had, in a technical sense, resolved the placement issue, the Bureau was concerned about the precedent and wished to formally note its objection. Furthermore, the Bureau was suspending Mercer's access to future placement services, which was a consequence that Whitmore described as regrettable but necessary. Gideon read the letter at the kitchen table. He passed it to Adeline without comment. She read it, she set it down. "They're suspending your access to future placement services," she said. "Yes." "You're married now." "Yes." "So that's, meaningless," he said. "Yes." She looked at the letter again. There was something in her expression, not amusement exactly, but something adjacent. "They put a great deal of effort into a formal objection to a situation that resolved itself 8 months ago," she said. "Bureaucracies do that. They want the last word." "They can have it," he said. He took the letter back and used it to light the stove. She watched him do this. That felt satisfying, she observed. Extremely, he said. The fall brought the work that fall always brought. The cattle sorted and sold, the winter stores laid in, the equipment checked and repaired and in some cases replaced. Adeline had developed, over the months, a particular relationship with the ranch's financial picture that went beyond what Gideon had originally described when he'd mentioned the account books to her. She understood now not just the numbers but the timing of them, when to sell and when to hold, how to read the seasonal pressures on cattle prices, what the hay costs implied about the coming winter. She'd started corresponding with a woman in Cheyenne who ran a small cattle brokering operation, and the correspondence had produced 2 sales at better prices than Gideon had managed previously. He'd noticed. He'd told her so, plainly, in the direct way he said things he meant, and she'd received it the way she received things, without deflection, without excessive modesty, with a clear acknowledgement that it mattered. "You could do this professionally," he said one evening, meaning the brokering work, the financial analysis. She looked at him across the table. "I am doing it professionally," she said. "This is my profession. I mean beyond the ranch. Other ranchers could use—" "Let's not get ahead," she said. "We have enough to manage." He let it go, but he didn't forget it. The winter that came was hard but not catastrophic. The specific distinction that matters on a ranch, where hard is survivable and catastrophic changes everything. They lost 2 steers to the cold in January, which was manageable. The east fence held. The north pasture water froze and was managed with the system Gideon had improved based on what had happened the previous February. The barn roof, the soft section Adeline had been right about, was reinforced properly in November before the snow came, and it held. On a January evening, deep in the winter, Adeline came to find Gideon in the barn, where he was working late on a harness repair that had become more involved than anticipated. She stood in the barn door with her coat on, and her breath coming in small clouds, and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up. She came in from the cold and shut the door behind her. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and her face doing something he hadn't seen it do before, something careful and a little uncertain and working toward a thing. "We're going to need the back room," she said. He looked at her. He understood what she meant before she said anything else, but he waited for her to say it because it was her thing to say. "Spring," she said. "I think late April or early May. I'm not certain of all the details. I've never done this before." She said it with the dry, specific honesty that was entirely her. "I thought you should know." He set down the harness. He crossed the barn. He stood in front of her and she looked up at him with the direct quality she'd had since the first moment on the station bench. And underneath it, something that was, for once, not managed. Something open and a little wide-eyed, and genuinely waiting for what he would say. "The back room needs new siding on the east wall," he said. "I'll do it before spring." She blinked. Then something shifted in her expression, the composure rearranging itself around something that was clearly relief, and just as clearly something warmer than relief. "That's what you're going to say?" she said. "I'm also going to say that I'm—" He stopped. He tried again. "That I can't—" He stopped again. He was bad at this, and they both knew it. "That this is—" He looked at her and gave up on the sentence entirely, and did what he should have done 2 attempts ago, which was to put his arms around her in the cold barn on a January night, which he did, and she let him, and stood there with her face against his shoulder and her hands still in her coat pockets, because the barn was cold, and this was them. Impractical gestures were not really their language, but this one they managed. After a moment, she said into his coat, "You're going to be terrible at the worrying part." "I know," he said. "You're going to try to manage everything, and it won't be possible, and you'll have to accept that." "I know," he said again. "I'm telling you in advance so you can work on it." "I appreciate the warning," he said. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not tears exactly, or not only tears, but the particular brightness that lives right next to them when something real has landed. "We're going to need more help next winter," she said. "I won't be able to. We'll need someone else." "I know. I'll find someone." "And Colt's staying through spring," he said. "He told me in November." She looked at him. "You knew he was staying?" "He asked me in November if I thought he could be trusted with more responsibility," Gideon said. "I told him I already trusted him. He said he'd stay through at least one more spring." "You should have told me." "I know. I forgot." "You didn't forget. she said. You thought I'd fuss. He said nothing. I wouldn't fuss, she said. No, he agreed. You'd have managed it. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she got when she was deciding whether to pursue something or let it go. She let it go. The east wall of the back room, she said. Get it done before March. February, he said. February, she agreed and went back to the house. He stood in the barn for a moment after she left, in the cold and the lamplight, with the harness on the bench and the horses shuffling in their stalls and the winter outside doing what it always did. He thought about what had just happened and what it meant, which was that the ranch he'd built alone for 9 years was becoming something he hadn't planned for and hadn't known to plan for. Not just a working operation, but a life with people in it, actual specific people whose presence had changed the shape of everything. He'd built the barn with his own hands. He'd built the house and the fences and the water systems. He understood building things. What he was only beginning to understand was that some things get built around you, in the daily weather of ordinary life, and you don't notice until you're already inside them. He picked up the harness. He finished the repair. He went inside, where the kitchen was warm, and Adeline was at the table with her paper and her lists, adding something in the deliberate handwriting he'd come to know as well as his own. He sat down. She passed him the coffee without looking up. February, he said. February, she confirmed, and went on writing. The baby came on a Wednesday, which Adeline always said afterward was the most ordinary possible day for something that changed everything. Late April, as she'd predicted, the 26th, with the Wyoming spring doing what Wyoming spring does, which is arrive incompletely, with patches of snow still holding in the north-facing hollows, and the grass coming in green below, while the air above still carried the memory of winter. Gideon had finished the east wall of the back room in February, as promised. He'd also, without telling Adeline, rebuilt the floor, replaced the single small window with one that let in more light, and constructed a simple wooden piece along the south wall that was somewhere between a shelf and a cabinet, fitted for the practical storage of small things. She'd seen it when he showed her the finished room and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. You said the east wall, he said, behind her. I did, she said. I had extra materials. She didn't say anything more about it, but she ran her hand along the cabinet edge with the attention she gave things that had been made well, and he understood that was its own kind of response. The labor was long, longer than either of them had been prepared for, and they'd tried to prepare. Gideon had ridden to Millhaven a month earlier to speak with the doctor, a competent and unsentimental man named Ferris, who had been delivering babies in the territory for 15 years and who gave Gideon a list of what would be needed and the information that someone should come for him when the time came. On the night of the 25th, when it became clear the time had come, Gideon sent Colt for Ferris at midnight and stayed in the house himself, which was the right decision and also the harder one, because there is a specific kind of helplessness in being present for something you cannot fix through work. He sat in the kitchen through the night. He made coffee he didn't drink. He listened to the sounds in the back room, Adeline's voice, occasionally, with the particular quality of someone managing something very difficult with the full force of their will. And he understood for the first time what it costs a person to bring another person into the world. Ferris arrived at 2 a.m. By 6, there was a daughter. Gideon was allowed in at 6:15. The room was pale with morning light coming through the new window, and Adeline was sitting up against the headboard with the infant in the arrangement of her arms, and she looked like someone who had been through something serious and come out the other side with the particular clarity that serious things sometimes leave behind them. The baby was red-faced and making small, continuous sounds that weren't quite crying but were clearly opinions. She has something to say, Adeline said. Her voice was rough, and she looked exhausted in the bone-deep way that sleep doesn't immediately fix. She comes by it naturally, Gideon said. Something moved in Adeline's expression, too tired for a real smile, but in that direction. Come and look at her, she said. He came and looked. The baby was small in the specific way that newborns are small, which is not the smallness of anything else. It's a complete smallness, a smallness that contains a whole person in a form you haven't met yet. She had dark hair, which surprised him for about 3 seconds before he remembered that Adeline had dark hair, and surprise was probably not the appropriate response. She looks like she's annoyed at being here, he said. She can join the rest of us, Adeline said. Ferris came in to check, made his assessment, gave his instructions in the terse, efficient manner of someone who has done this 15 years and knows what matters and what doesn't, and left before 7. Colt looked in briefly from the doorway with an expression of genuine awe that he didn't bother to hide, said nothing at all, and quietly took on the entire morning feeding operation without being asked. They named her Clara. Not after anyone, just a name they'd discussed and agreed on with the same unsentimentality they brought to other decisions. Clara Mercer, born on the 26th of April on a Wyoming ranch to 2 people who had come to each other through the most unlikely logistics and had built something real from them. The years that followed did not simplify. Anyone who tells you that a growing family simplifies a hard life has not had a growing family or a hard life, or possibly both. What happens instead is that the complexity increases and the reasons for managing it become more specific, and that specificity is its own kind of clarification. Clara was a child who came into the world with opinions and kept them. By the time she was walking, she had already demonstrated a preference for the barn over the house, for horses over everything else, and for Colt's company over most adults except her parents. She was not a quiet child. She was not what anyone would describe as easy. She fell off things and got up, broke things, and understood that breaking them was part of learning their limits, asked questions constantly and at inconvenient times, and had her mother's quality of attention and her father's quality of silence in turns, which meant you never quite knew which one you were going to get. Colt, who had stayed through the spring as he'd said, and then through another season and then another after that, was her first great admirer and also her first great disciplinarian, which is the particular combination that makes someone indispensable to a child. He taught her to ride at 3, which was too young and resulted in 2 falls and a determination that made Adeline set down whatever she was doing and simply watch. He told her the names of things in the fields and the sky with the patience of someone who still remembered not knowing them. He was 20 when she was born and 23 when he finally left, heading north into Montana with a letter from Gideon in his coat pocket and a destination that was somewhere between certain and improvised. And Clara stood in the yard and watched his horse go until it was a dot on the ridge, and then she turned around and went to the barn and stayed there for an hour. And when she came out, she didn't mention it. She was 3. She was already learning what to do with loss. Adeline saw this and said to Gideon that night, "She's going to be fine." "She's 3, he said. The way she handled it. She didn't fall apart. She went somewhere quiet and came back. That's exactly what you do." He thought about this. "I don't know if that's a compliment." "It's a true thing," Adeline said. "Whether it's a compliment depends on what you do with the quiet." The ranch grew, though not simply. The Patterson land, which had seemed expensive when Gideon bought it, proved over time to be the decision that changed the ranch's long-term viability. The additional grazing area allowed herd expansion at a pace that the original land couldn't have supported, and the better road access to the east fence reduced the winter management cost in ways that compounded year over year. By the time Clara was 5, the Mercer operation was among the mid-sized ranches in the valley, no longer the smallest enterprise that certain ranchers could afford to dismiss. Adeline's correspondence with the cattle broker in Cheyenne had grown into something Gideon still occasionally described as side work, but which was no longer really a side anything. She had an eye for market timing that she'd developed from years of reading the ranch's financial landscape, and the broker, a woman named Hester Vance who ran her business with a bluntness that Adeline respected, had started paying her a consulting fee for her assessments. It wasn't a large sum, and it wasn't consistent, but it was hers, and she kept it separately and used it for the things she decided needed doing without running them through the ranch accounts. Gideon knew about this arrangement and said nothing, which was the clearest possible indication of what he thought about it. Other women started coming to Adeline, not immediately and not in a rush. It happened the way water finds its way through rock, slowly, and through whatever openings exist. A rancher's wife named Nell Farber came first, ostensibly about a sewing question, but actually about a different question entirely, the kind that takes a long time to find the words for. Her husband wanted to sell their place and move to a town in Nebraska, and she didn't want to go. And she wanted to know how a woman decided what she was allowed to want. Adeline made her tea and listened and said, "You don't get permission for what you want. You just have to know what it is and say it." "What if he doesn't listen?" Then you've learned something about him, Adeline said, and you make the next decision based on that. Nell went home and told her husband she wasn't going to Nebraska, a conversation that took 3 days and was not comfortable and ended with them not going to Nebraska. She came back a month later to return a cup she'd borrowed and stayed for 2 hours and said nothing about Nebraska, but talked about everything else, which is how some friendships start. Martha Decker came, and Patricia Webb, whose husband ran the grain exchange, and eventually even Helen Schertz, who arrived with an apple cake and the particular manner of someone who has decided a realignment is necessary and is doing it with as much dignity as the situation allows. Adeline received her with the same directness she gave everyone. Not warm, exactly, not in the performed way, but genuinely present, which is what people actually want when they come for something they can't name. Helen stayed 2 hours and left having said, at the door, with the stiff honesty of someone who finds honesty stiff. I was wrong about you. I want you to know I know that. I know you know, Adeline said. That's why you came. Helen looked at her. Then she almost smiled and left. Gideon watched this develop without commenting, which was his primary mode of support and which Adeline had long understood was the most useful thing he could offer. He was not a man who needed to be at the center of what happened around him. He let things be what they were and worked on what needed working on. And the fact that his wife was becoming something in the valley beyond a rancher's wife, something that women drove to find, struck him as both unsurprising and worth being quiet about so as not to disturb it. But Crane remained Crane. He did not go away, and he did not become a different person, and anyone who expected him to had not understood what men like Crane actually are. They are not temporary obstacles who learn lessons. They are permanent features of the landscape, like rock formations, present and influential and unchanging. And the adjustment required is not in them, but in learning to navigate around them. What changed was the leverage. The water rights challenge that had failed due to Patterson's defection had cost Crane political standing in the valley that he spent years quietly working to recover. The grazing fund settlement had added to that cost, not ruinously, but in the specific currency of a man whose authority depends on appearing larger than the facts, and visible setbacks in that currency are not easily recovered. Ranchers who had deferred to Crane reflexively started calculating more carefully before doing so. Some of them started talking to Gideon instead, which was less about Gideon being more powerful than Crane and more about wanting access to someone who operated differently. Crane and Gideon had a conversation about this eventually, 5 years after Adeline had arrived. In the fall, at the livestock auction that was the valley's primary social event. It was not a friendly conversation, but it was direct, which both of them preferred to the alternative. You've been working against me for 5 years, Crane said. Not aggressive, observational. I've been working for the ranch, Gideon said. When that puts me against you, I don't change course. Crane looked at him. He was getting older, they all were, and age had not softened him, but had clarified him, stripped away some of the performance, and left the simpler thing underneath. Your wife, he said. She's the one who found the grazing discrepancy. Yes, I'd have done the same thing. I know, Gideon said. That's why you understand it. A pause. Crane looked out at the auction yard, the cattle, the ranchers, the October sky. The bureau man asked me once if I thought she'd last, he said. I've heard that said a number of times, Gideon said. I told him I didn't know. Crane was quiet for a moment. I was wrong, and I don't say that about many things. It was not an apology. Crane was not constructed for apologies. But it was something, and Gideon received it as what it was, an acknowledgement from a man who gave those rarely and meant them when he gave them. The South Ridge, Gideon said. What about it? You never renewed the grazing rights. I fenced it. But the fencing there is inefficient for both of us given the terrain. Crane looked at him. What are you suggesting? A shared access arrangement, formal this time, through the grazing fund, benefits both operations. Crane considered this with the careful thought of someone who has learned to assess offers from people he'd underestimated. Your wife would have to look at the numbers, he said. She would, Gideon said. That's not a problem. Crane almost smiled. It wasn't a warm expression, but it was real. No, he said. I don't imagine it is. They worked out the arrangement over the following month. Adeline reviewed the numbers twice, and revised Crane's proposed terms once, without apology, with the same direct manner she brought to everything. Crane accepted the revision. The South Ridge Access Agreement was signed and filed with the Grazing Fund, and both operations benefited from it, which is the particular satisfaction of resolving something on terms that are fair rather than on terms that one party imposed. Well, Clara was 7 when she started coming to the kitchen table for the financial discussions. She didn't ask permission. She came in one evening when Gideon and Adeline were going over the fall cattle accounts and sat down and watched with the focused silence she'd inherited from one parent and the direct questions she'd inherited from the other. "What does that number mean?" she said, pointing at a figure in the ledger. Adeline looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the ledger. "That's what we spent on feed this season compared to last season," he said. "It's more," Clara said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because we have more cattle than last season." Clara thought about this. "But if we have more cattle, do we make more money when we sell them?" "If the price is right," Adeline said. "How do you know what the right price is?" "You watch the market over time," Adeline said. "You learn the patterns. You talk to people who see more of it than you do." Clara absorbed this. "Can I learn that?" "You're 7, Gideon said. "I can still learn it," Clara said, with the specific patience of a child who is accustomed to adults pointing out her age as if it were a limitation rather than a current fact. Adeline said, "Yes, you can learn it." Gideon said nothing further. He went back to the ledger. Clara stayed at the table for the rest of the discussion, asking questions when she had them and staying quiet when she didn't, which was a combination that most adults couldn't manage. He thought about what Adeline had told him once, in the early days. A life that was real rather than comfortable. He looked at his daughter sitting at the kitchen table learning the arithmetic of how their life worked, and he thought that this was what real looked like. Not dramatic, not resolved into something easy, just present and ongoing and full of the actual texture of things. Os. The letter from the Bureau came one more time, 8 years after the first one. This time it was not addressed to Gideon. It was addressed to Adeline. The Bureau, under new management, was reconsidering its placement policies in light of what it described as changing frontier conditions. The letter was from a woman named Constance Mills, who had been appointed to review the Bureau's practices after a report from the Territorial Women's Commission had criticized the organization's evaluation criteria. Constance Mills had apparently done research, and the research had included speaking to several women in the Wyoming Valley about the realities of frontier life for women, and several of those women had mentioned Adeline Rowan Mercer by name. Mills wanted to know, she wrote, if Mrs. Mercer would be willing to share her perspective on what qualities actually mattered for a woman's success in frontier placement, as opposed to the qualities the Bureau had traditionally prioritized, which the report had characterized, in the particular language of official documents, as insufficiently evidence-based. Adeline read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning with her coffee. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the ranch yard, where Clara was doing something unauthorized near the barn that involved the hay fork and a determination that would either result in a completed task or a problem that needed adult attention. Gideon came in from the morning feeding and she handed him the letter. He read it. "They want your opinion," he said. "They want me to tell them they were wrong," she said, in useful enough terms that they can revise their practices. "Are you going to?" She picked up her coffee. "Yes," she said, "but not the way they're expecting." She spent 3 evenings writing the response, a document that was not emotional and not vindictive and not triumphant, but was instead a precise and practical analysis of what actually determines whether a woman can build a life on the frontier. Not age, not physical appearance, not the ability to fit a profile that some man in Chicago had designed from assumptions. Practical intelligence. The capacity to learn unfamiliar things without requiring them to resemble familiar things. The willingness to work without the benefit of witnesses. The ability to stay inside difficulty long enough to understand it before trying to change it. She wrote about things she'd seen in other women in the valley, in Nell Farber and Martha Decker, and even Helen Schurtz, who had more frontier substance in her than the Bureau's criteria would have recognized. She wrote about what she herself had not known when she came and had learned. That the land teaches you what it needs if you listen to it, That the work is hard in ways you can't fully anticipate, but also rewarding in ways you can't anticipate either. That the loneliness is real but not the same as isolation. And that being genuinely useful to something larger than yourself is not a consolation prize, but the actual thing. She wrote 2 pages. She revised them to 1.5. She sent the letter. Constance Mills wrote back within 3 weeks. The correspondence continued for 4 months. Some of what Adeline wrote found its way into the Bureau's revised evaluation criteria, which was adopted the following year. She never knew exactly which parts. Gideon read the revised criteria when a copy arrived with a note from Mills. He read it in the kitchen and then set it on the table and said, "They took the age restriction out." "Yes," Adeline said. "And what was it they called it? Physical adaptability assessment." "Which was never about physical adaptability," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't." He looked at the document a moment longer. "They should have asked you years ago." "They weren't ready years ago," she said. "Neither was I, probably. I needed to know what I was talking about before I talked about it." He looked at her across the kitchen, the same table, the stove with its same tendency to run hot on the left side, which they'd simply accepted as the stove's character rather than a problem to fix. 8 years had changed things and not changed things, the way time does. The harness he'd been mending when Garrett came to the ranch was long replaced. The bay mare had died 2 years back and been replaced by a chestnut gelding that Clara had named without consulting anyone. Colt sent letters from Montana once or twice a year, writing in the big looping hand of someone who learned penmanship late, and the letters were usually about cattle and weather and occasionally about a woman he'd met, and they felt like reading dispatches from a life that had gone on past the story you'd known. The Patterson land had been fully integrated into the ranch operation. The water rights were settled, the fence lines were where they needed to be. These were facts, and facts were what the ranch ran on. But the thing that Gideon sat with, on an ordinary morning in the kitchen with the coffee going and the account books open and his daughter's voice audible from the barn and his wife writing something at the other end of the table, the thing that was true underneath all the practical facts, was that he'd built the ranch alone for 9 years and understood it as a series of problems to be solved. And what the last 8 years had taught him was that a ranch, like anything worth having, is not a series of problems. It's a life. And lives don't get solved. They get lived, with people in them, through seasons that are bad, and seasons that are better, and the daily work that holds all of it together. He'd known this intellectually before. He'd felt it only after Adeline came. On a September afternoon when Clara was 9, she came in from the barn and sat down at the kitchen table across from her mother with an expression Adeline recognized as the one that preceded a serious question. "What?" Adeline said without looking up from what she was writing. "Mary Tanner at school said her mother said you were sent back," Clara said, "like something that got returned to the store." Adeline set down her pen. She looked at her daughter, at the direct dark eyes and the composed posture that was both her parents in different proportions, and the particular quality of waiting that meant she was going to sit here until she had a real answer. "That's true," Adeline said. "I was. The agency that arranged for me to come here decided I wasn't suitable, and they put me on a train back east." Clara thought about this. "Why?" "Because I was 34 years old and they thought that was too old." "Too old for what?" "For frontier life." Adeline picked up her pen and set it down again. "They had an idea in their heads about what a frontier woman should look like, and I didn't match it." "Were they right?" "No," Adeline said. "They were wrong." Clara was quiet for a moment, absorbing this with the thoroughness she absorbed everything. "Were you scared?" she said, "when they sent you back?" Adeline thought about the train station, the waiting room, the bench, the trunk, the careful arrangement of her composure around something that hurt. "Yes," she said. "I was scared. I was also—" She paused. "I was angry. I thought I'd been treated unfairly." "Had you?" "Yes." "So what did you do?" "Your father drove 11 miles in the dark and offered me a choice," Adeline said. "And I made it." Clara sat with this for a while. Outside, through the window, the September light was doing what September light does in Wyoming, golden and slightly melancholy, the quality of something good that knows its ending. "I'm going to tell Mary Tanner's mother she was wrong," Clara said. "You don't have to," Adeline said. "I know I don't have to. Clara stood up. I'm going to anyway. She went back outside. Adeline watched the door close behind her and thought about 9-year-olds who have decided something, and the specific quality of that determination, which is different from adult determination because it hasn't yet learned to talk itself out of things. She picked up her pen. That evening, when Gideon came in for supper, Clara was already telling him about Mary Tanner and what she planned to say. He listened with the particular expression he got when he was being careful not to interfere with something that was going the right way on its own. What do you think? Clara said. I think you know what you're going to say, he said. You don't need me to tell you. I want to know if you think I'm right. I think you're right, he said. Clara accepted this and went to set the table, which she did with the efficiency she'd picked up from years of watching her mother, moving through the kitchen as if she'd been navigating it since before she had language, which was almost true. Gideon sat down and looked at Adeline, and something passed between them in the way things pass between people who have spent years learning to read each other. Something that wasn't a whole conversation but contained one. He thought about what it meant that their daughter had heard her mother was sent back and had immediately decided that someone needed to be corrected. He thought about where she'd learned that the right response to injustice was not to absorb it quietly but to say something about it. He thought about a train station and a cold bench, and a woman who had looked at him without looking away first. There is a version of the story of the Mercer Ranch that presents itself as a story about one choice, a man driving 11 miles in the dark, a woman stepping away from a waiting train. That version is not wrong, but it's incomplete, because the truth about choices is that they are not single events. They are inaugurations. Every choice worth making opens into 1,000 smaller choices that follow it, daily and unglamorous and real, and the actual content of a life is in those 1,000 smaller ones. In February mornings and broken fence lines and arguments about cattle rotation and the particular quality of sitting at a table with someone who knows what you mean before you finish saying it. Adeline Rowan came to a Wyoming ranch because a stranger offered her a choice. She stayed because of everything that choice became: the work, the land, the seasons of difficulty and competence, and the occasional satisfaction of having gotten something right. She stayed because of a man who was not smooth or perfect and said what he meant in the halting direct way of someone who has not practiced saying things, and who made room for her without asking her to be smaller. She stayed because the life was real, the way she'd wanted it to be, and real things are worth staying for. What she built on that ranch, the fences and the financial records, and the correspondence with Hester Vance and Constance Mills and Nell Farber and the rest, none of it was what she'd imagined when she'd written a letter to a stranger in Wyoming from a rented room in Ohio. It was better than imagined, which is not the same as easier. It was hers, which is not something the Bureau of Placement could have predicted or approved, which is exactly the point. The woman they sent back became the woman the valley came to, not because she proved she was what they'd wanted, but because she turned out to be something better, herself, without apology, in full possession of what she knew and willing to say so. That, in the end, is the only kind of suitable there is. And the ranch went on, through its seasons, full of imperfect people doing the necessary work, which is all that any home, anywhere, has ever been made of.